He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're on the cusp of October. It's the final day of September that has arrived, and with such a luxurious arrival, we of course have to celebrate with the discussion of something scary, something a little bit paranormal. Before we get into that, a couple of short plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, YouTube, X, and Facebook. Additionally, should you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via CryptidClues@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's get into this. Now, personally, I have only been to a few haunted locations myself. British Columbia isn't really privy to a rich haunted history. Of course, there are a few locations, but in the past, we've explored some of these places, but what I mainly attribute it to is that Canada's western side is fairly new. Settlements didn't really take off until the late 1800s out here. Of course, we have Indigenous folks that are already living out here, and spiritualism is a very, very powerful and heavily attached component to that history and that historical way of life. But the specific focus here is when these settlements started to form. You have these settlers coming over here and building buildings and homes and whatnot. And so when you have individuals passing away, leaving behind whatever residual form of themselves remains to inhabit the old structure, that's when things start to get interesting. So when I say much of Western Canada is new, in comparison to the eastern provinces, from what I could find, eastern settlements started appearing as early as the 1600s. So you can imagine that those old buildings are holding a lot more history and paranormal energies or occupants, dare I say, as well. But maybe that's being a little too bold, but I digress. We're here today to chat about a couple of hauntings across North America, not solely in British Columbia. I'm kind of going a little bit south of the border here to our friends down under Canada. With that, our first hotspot is Victoria's Black Swan Inn. This is located in San Antonio, Texas. Now, I say hotspot because it's apparently infested with just dozens of spirits. And while the building sits on a 35-acre property, it serves primarily as a wedding venue, surrounded by 100-year-old oak trees. Beautiful historic location. It was built back in the mid to late 1800s, where 50 years prior was actually the location of the Battle of Salado. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This battle took place in 1842 when Mexican forces invaded the Republic of Texas. Just over 200 Texas Rangers fought against an army of 1,600 Mexican soldiers and Cherokee warriors. Now, once this building was constructed, it saw many changes of hands and ownership. This changing of hands helped create a very dynamic change of pace for the property. For example, one served as a dairy farm, so the barn behind the primary residence is reportedly the most haunted on the property. It did house members of previous families that actually were living on the property as well, including later occupants who all had passed on the property. So there's a lot of individuals that lived here, moved into here, and they lived here till they died. Now, currently, the latest owner lives in the home on the property with their family. So while it's not serving as a functioning inn anymore, it's still open up to ghost tours and, of course, a great venue for getting married. Companies, paranormal investigators that focus on ghost tours and whatnot, they come around and they'll explore and try to learn more about the property. So while we've highlighted that history a bit, many while living on the property have fallen ill and actually passed, as we said already. So one case of this involved the Woods family. where Mrs. Jolene Woods, she had died of cancer, unfortunately, leaving her husband behind. Now, her husband, Park was his name, did not handle her death very well. It hit his depression very, very severely, and he actually hung himself with his belt from the poster of his own bed. Very tragic. And now as we turn towards specific activity, apparitions have been sighted all over the property. But in the house, specifically, one of the upstairs bedrooms is said to be home of a young woman's spirit, usually sighted sitting on the bed inside the room. This is tied with frequent dips in temperature, occurring in select spots around the house. And now not only, of course, in this bedroom, but we have unexplainable noises and frequently lights turning off and on at random. One of the more uneasier spirits that has been sighted on this property is that of a man who is stalking angrily around the home, almost as if he's looking for something. Now, in an additionally rare scenario, and this really made me start to wonder in regards to other hauntings and locations, are trigger scenarios. There is the spirit of a young boy that only becomes active when other children are present on the property. Very fascinating to think about, and that's where I think that could probably have some major applications to other haunted hotspots. Now, this inn stands as one of the top 10 most haunted places in Texas. Moving on to our next haunted location. This is the Swoden House in Los Angeles, California. Built in 1926 for a photographer by the name of John Soden. His family was very young at the time when they all moved in here, and the house saw many good years, parties, overall happy times. It was a good time. Good time. Eventually, though, a Dr. George Hodel moved into the house in 1945, which then leads us to one of America's most well-known cold cases, still to this day, the Black Dahlia. Now, Elizabeth Short, born July 29th, 1924, died January of 1947. Now, Dr. George Hodel became prime suspect number one. Many crime aficionados are convinced that Dr. Hodel did indeed do it in the home itself. And after this horrific incident, though, the home eventually it became abandoned periodically throughout the late 20th century. But the son of Dr. Hodel, Steve Hodel, he eventually became the owner, and he did live there for a period of time. He was told by individuals of the home's unsettling aesthetic, although nothing of anything very noteworthy seemed to have appeared to have happened to Steve Hodel, at least from what I researched. But he was aware of things that did happen, occurrences that were taking place on this property with owners that were after him. One such was the case of a former Soden housekeeper who relayed stories of the home being pure evil, just bad. Now, with such luxurious parties that had taken place on site once Dr. Hodel had taken over ownership, many murders also occurred amongst artists, philosophers, accountants, and politicians. Now, I'm not saying they are all guilty, but just that they all were frequent visitors on the guest list for the party nights at this house. Now, Dr. Hodel also had a daughter, and during this time, she came forward with reports that when she was inside the home, she could see the spirit of a young woman in the basement. There are very other uncomfortable things that are associated with that daughter. I'm not going to get into it on this episode. Some of it is very disturbing, but I will say that she ran away in one scenario and she did not want to go back. It was just a terrible home life in this little world here. So this house definitely has a negative aesthetic tied to it. And so from the things that I read, and I recommend, like, if you're interested, like, take a little bit more of a deep dive on this property. But I digress. Now, so we have Dr. Hodel, that is prime suspect number one, like I said, has a daughter, has a son. So there are some things here in closing that Steve Hodel, who was a retired LAPD detective, started to look into when he started to get his dad's personal belongings after he passed. A lot of history kind of started to get revealed, and he found some photos of a lady which he actually believes was Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. He also suspects that he murdered his secretary, who remains unidentified. And that was just the start. As the years went on, he became convinced that his father was responsible for a number of unsolved brutal murders that had taken place in the home's basement. So there is a lot of mystery still attached to this, but there is also a lot of energy and negativity in this home too. But moving on to our next haunted location, this takes us to the Villisca Axe Murder House in Iowa. Like the home prior, this one has tragic history attached to it. On June 10th, 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore were horrifically killed inside their home, located in Villisca, Iowa. Their 4 children and 2 friends who were spending the night there were also all murdered. Now, this, like prior, also remains unsolved to this day, with the home earning the status of one of America's most haunted houses. They've had many tours that they actually cut short due to falling and flying objects, moving ladders, and children's voices. Now, on the night of November 7th, 2014, there was a ghost hunter and his older parents. They had checked into the murder house. Now, the building's caretaker, Johnny Hauser, he was checking in on the guests that night. Seeing that everything and everyone was fine, he left to go home for the evening. A few hours later, it was discovered that the ghost hunter was in a pool of his own blood with a hunting knife in his chest. Conclusion? He stabbed himself for no apparent reason. Now, in the caretaker's own words, he describes the night and after the stabbing refused to stay overnight and eventually avoided being there alone altogether. And I quote, "When I came to the house originally, I didn't believe in ghosts. Honestly, I thought it was stupid. I remember texting my buddies and just saying, look at my job's website with the ghost photos. Now, I got the job at the house not long after I'd moved to Villisca with my wife. The next morning after the incident, though, I woke up, picked up my phone, and saw the social media headlines of man stabs himself at Axe Murder House. I just couldn't believe it. I later found out that the gentleman was alone in the house at the time of doing a solo paranormal investigation in one of the kids' bedrooms, which is where his parents had actually found him lying on the floor. He was life flighted to a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska, where he actually survived." End quote. Now, this caretaker actually got a chance years later to speak to this investigator, but all the investigator could recall is that he was alone in the bedroom making verbal threats in an attempt at provoking any spirits. Cuts to black for him, and then he's waking up in the emergency room without any recollection of what happened. And as he was talking about this, he started to tear up, and he did apologize in retrospect for when he had arrived on site and the caretaker was kind of letting them in. He was being very, very forward and very kind of verbally aggressive, just calling them out. So it wasn't solely just in this children's bedroom, but this was something that started the moment that they arrived on the property. But moving on, we get to our last hotspot for this episode. Now, this is the Lizzie Borden house in Fall River, Massachusetts. Now, another unsolved murder case involving Andrew and Abby Borden. Lizzie Borden was Andrew's daughter, while Abby was her stepmother. Andrew served as a bank president, and after eventually buying this home back in 1872, did a bunch of renovations on it, totally just tuned it up. But the main thing was just basically taking it from being a two-family apartment, 2 apartments, and putting it all together into one massive house for his family. He wasn't big on the latest tech, so it didn't get a lot of indoor plumbing or electricity. It was pretty old school still. So the basement is where there was a 2-stall privy, and then each bed had its own chamber pot. So you're good to go if you had to go in the middle of the night. Now, being someone in a higher position, the home was ultimately considered middle class. All in all, the home housed Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Lizzie's older sister, Emma, including a housemaid who actually was staying in the attic. Now, the house was relatively quiet, no parties, anything rambunctious. The main thing here was that Lizzie was embarrassed because, well, they did have a high society vibe to their family. They were not short on money. The house was looked at as being middle class, so it was not something that she wanted to necessarily flaunt with her friends. At least that's what the reports go by in the research that I found. So until we get to August 4th, 1892. Both Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally murdered in their home. And at the time, Abby was 64 years old and was killed in the guest room, while Andrew, 70 years old, was killed on the sofa in the downstairs sitting room. These attacks were conducted with an axe. I warn you, there are photos online you can see that were taken of these attacks, and it's pretty descriptive as well in the reports made by investigators. It was not a very clean situation. They were very much brutally murdered. It's pretty unfortunate. Now, Lizzie became the prime suspect here, and when the police basically went up to her and were trying to talk to her, she provided strange and sometimes contradictory answers. It did not make sense, but ultimately she was acquitted in court. So she moved on with her life, bought property elsewhere. I did find a little bit of note here that her parents had relinquished her entitlement to the home that same year. So that's something that I just thought was kind of interesting. But with the crime history behind us now, paranormal researchers, they visited this hotspot, and they say the main case here is Lizzie's parents, the spirits of them walking on the grounds, moving around. There's also 2 children's spirits that are also present on the property. Now, apparently, if we go back, we have 2 children that were murdered next door in 1848 by their mother. I tried to look into more information on that, and I was not too successful in finding much, so I'm going to take that with a light grain of salt. Reports, however, do claim that Lizzie's spirit is attached to this house, even though she passed elsewhere, I believe, and not passed in this property or in this home. Now, since her stepmother Abby was responsible for the house chores, many actually report seeing her in the second floor hallway and guest room. Now, since this home also serves as a bed and breakfast today, in the present day, it's open to guests staying there. Some guests have reported that the guest room bed sheets actually are tightening while they sleep. They can hear hand brushing noises along the sides as if the bed sheets are being tucked in. And then they do feel pressure applied to their chest and their legs. Very, very, very uncomfortable. If I was sleeping and that happened, that would definitely terrify me. And I've spoken to a few people that have had interesting things happen when they are going to sleep, and that just seems to be like the time to be a ghost. But I digress. That is it for this week's episode. I had a few more hauntings I was going to file in there, but I thought, you know what? We have a whole month to get into this, and I'm going to spread it across the entire month. It's going to be a good time. I'm excited to get into the paranormal vibe of things right now with Halloween coming around. It's going to be great. We're going to be back next week, both Reuben and I. Now, he prepped a rabbit hole of a topic to discuss, so stay tuned for that. I'm very excited for it. And like I said, we're getting into Halloween. We're going to be dropping more haunting episodes and going full on into the paranormal. So be sure to check us out at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels. And if you want to chat with us directly, shoot an email our way, cryptidclues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.